In the realm of international relations, countries are seldom guided by sentiment. Rather, they are influenced by necessity, proximity, and power. The global stage is a chessboard, not a playground, and each nation's move is calculated, deliberate, and driven by interest rather than idealism. When analyzing America's support, or at the very least its lenient stance, toward Pakistan in its dealings with India, it is crucial to understand that what appears to be favoritism or double standards is more accurately a strategic alignment rooted in geography and the larger architecture of international power dynamics. Pakistan is not simply another country in South Asia, it is a uniquely positioned nation that sits at the intersection of several major geopolitical fault lines, bordering Afghanistan, Iran, China, and of course India. This makes it a pivot point in America's strategic calculations, particularly in a region that has remained volatile, nuclear-armed, and persistently unstable. Following the Cold War, the US began to reposition its military and diplomatic resources in a world no longer defined by a bipolar rivalry with the Soviet Union. Instead, it faced the challenge of fragmented threats, decentralized terrorism, and emerging regional powers. Pakistan, long allied with the US through the Cold War as a hedge against Soviet influence in South Asia, became even more significant after the events of September 11, 2001. Its geographical proximity to Afghanistan transformed it into a logistical linchpin. American troops needed access to Afghan terrain. Supply lines had to pass through Pakistani airspace and ground routes. Intelligence operations against terror networks required on-the-ground cooperation. While India provided diplomatic support, Pakistan offered something more tactical, real-time physical access to the heart of the US's military agenda in the region. This alone shifted America's tone from distant criticism to cautious collaboration. Pakistan became more than just a partner. It became a conduit through which America could wage a war it could not afford to lose. Moreover, Pakistan shares a long and sensitive border with China, a country the United States increasingly sees not just as a competitor, but as its primary global rival in terms of economy, technology, and influence. In recent years, as China has expanded its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, with Pakistan being a flagship participant through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, Washington's attention has sharpened further. While CPEC might seem like a bilateral deal between Islamabad and Beijing, its strategic implications are far broader. The infrastructure built under CPEC provides China direct access to the Arabian Sea, bypassing the Malacca Strait, a route currently dominated by American naval power. This raises alarm bells in Washington and in turn increases Pakistan's value not just as a regional partner, but as a buffer, a pressure point, and a gateway. The US may not directly support Pakistan's growing closeness to China, but neither can it afford to alienate Pakistan and push it further into Beijing's embrace. The need to keep Pakistan within some circle of influence becomes a calculated move rather than a diplomatic oversight. India, on the other hand, while geographically vast and democratically vibrant, does not always align itself neatly with Washington's strategic doctrines. New Delhi's insistence on strategic autonomy means it refuses to become an appendage of Western policy, despite being a natural ideological ally. Its continued defense ties with Russia, its independent position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and its non-aligned posture on the Ukraine war are seen as indicators of an unpredictable partner. America respects India, even courts it with trade deals and defense collaborations, but the relationship is one of equals, not one of influence. In contrast, with Pakistan, America often finds more leverage. This imbalance of leverage versus alignment becomes another piece on the chessboard. Strategic patience with Pakistan allows the US a foothold in a region where no permanent allies exist, only permanent interests. Adding complexity is the proximity to Iran, another nation in Washington's crosshairs. Pakistan's location makes it a neighbor not just to instability, but to opportunity. From countering extremist spillover from Afghanistan, to monitoring Iran's movements, to gauging Chinese influence westward, the terrain Pakistan occupies is more than just land. It is leverage. Control, or at least influence, over this space gives Washington a kind of soft power not easily replicated elsewhere. If America loses its grip on Pakistan, it loses access to an entire corridor of strategic importance, a corridor that stretches from the oil fields of Iran to the deserts of Xinjiang, from the Taliban strongholds to China's infrastructural ambitions. Thus, while American support for Pakistan may seem confusing or unjust from the outside, especially to those who champion democratic values and expect consistency in alliances, it is actually a product of relentless calculation. In the hard-nosed world of geopolitics, morals take a backseat to maps, and treaties are often scribbled over lines of latitude and longitude. Pakistan's strategic geography is both its greatest asset and its most dangerous burden, drawing attention, money, and military cooperation, even as it struggles with internal governance and external conflict. It remains, whether deliberately or reluctantly, a vital square on the board, a square no superpower is willing to concede, especially not in a game where China looms large on the other side. The partnership between the United States and Pakistan in the realm of counterterrorism is not born from shared values, mutual trust, or ideological alignment. It is rather a consequence of historical necessity, strategic desperation, and mutual exploitation. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, the global landscape shifted drastically. The US, blindsided and bloodied, declared a war on terror, but it could not fight that war alone. It needed ground-level intelligence, physical access to terror hotspots, and regional actors willing or at least pressured to cooperate. Pakistan, by virtue of its geography and entangled history with the Taliban and various extremist networks, emerged not just as a logical partner, but as a critical gatekeeper to America's new war front. The border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, porous and largely unregulated, became the most sought-after theater for intelligence gathering and drone operations. The tribal areas of Pakistan's northwest became both a refuge for terrorists and a battlefield for covert operations. Pakistan was no longer just a state in South Asia. It had become the very terrain upon which the next era of American military doctrine would unfold. But this partnership was never clean. It was always riddled with contradictions and hypocrisies. The same Pakistan that the US depended on to track down al-Qaeda militants was the one accused of sheltering them. The most glaring example, of course, being Osama bin Laden, who was found living comfortably in Abbottabad, a military garrison town, just a short distance from Pakistan's equivalent of West Point. This moment sent shockwaves through American political circles and ignited a firestorm of doubt over Islamabad's sincerity. Yet, in spite of such betrayals, the United States could not, and did not, sever ties. The very next year, billions in aid continued to flow to Pakistan, both directly and through military cooperation programs. This paradox was not a result of diplomatic naivete, but of pragmatic compromise. Pakistan remained too strategically significant to abandon, and its intelligence network, particularly the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, was too deeply embedded in the region to replace. Washington needed access to human assets on the ground, to logistic networks, and to pathways that only Pakistani intermediaries could navigate without detection or backlash. Even at the height of mistrust, American drones flew over Pakistani airspace, often with quiet consent, targeting safe houses and militant gatherings. Civilian casualties mounted, anti-American sentiment grew, but the US could not disengage. This cooperation was a double-edged sword. On one side, it allowed for the assassination of high-profile terror figures such as Baitullah Mehsud and later Ayman al-Zawahiri. On the other, it created a cycle of resentment and re-radicalization among Pakistan's local populations, who saw these strikes as violations of sovereignty and justice. Meanwhile, the Pakistani government played a precarious balancing act. It publicly condemned drone strikes and US military intrusions, yet privately allowed or even facilitated them. This duplicity was not lost on either side, but it was tolerated. For the US, Pakistan's double game was frustrating but manageable. For Pakistan, American aid and international backing were worth the indignity of hypocrisy. Financially, the counterterrorism partnership became a billion-dollar equation. From 2001 to 2020, Pakistan received over $30 billion in civilian and military aid, much of it under the guise of counterterrorism efforts. This flow of money served several purposes. It bought cooperation, silenced internal dissent, and equipped Pakistan's military with updated weaponry and surveillance tools. But it also created dependency. Pakistan's economy became partially reliant on these funds, and in return, the US found itself entangled in a relationship it could not easily exit without jeopardizing regional stability. Each terror incident, each intelligence breakthrough, each captured or killed militant served to justify continued engagement, even as questions about transparency and sincerity grew louder. Simultaneously, Pakistan's role in nurturing extremist elements for its own strategic objectives further complicated the counterterrorism narrative. The same networks that provided the US with intelligence were often deeply interconnected with groups like the Haqqani Network or Lashkar-e-Taiba, entities known for launching attacks in Afghanistan and India. This complex web of alliances meant that America's fight against terrorism in the region was never linear. It wasn't a clean-cut campaign against enemies hidden in caves. It was a murky contest within a state that held the keys to both the problem and the solution. The United States, in effect, outsourced part of its counterterrorism strategy to a state actor that could never fully be trusted, but one that remained indispensable. Washington had to walk a tightrope. Too much pressure on Islamabad could sever ties and push Pakistan closer to China or lead to internal collapse. Too little scrutiny allowed dangerous double dealings to continue unchecked. This transactional reality of counterterrorism leverage has led to a deeply flawed but strangely persistent relationship. The US continues to frame Pakistan as a major non-NATO ally, even as think tanks and intelligence briefings highlight ongoing concerns about terrorist sanctuaries and ideological sympathies within the Pakistani military establishment. Each time an American president has vowed to reassess the relationship, events on the ground have forced recalibration. New threats emerge, old enemies resurface under new banners, and the cycle renews itself. For every act of betrayal, there is a diplomatic justification. For every broken promise, there is a new funding package. The rhetoric shifts from with us or against us to an imperfect partner in a perfect storm, and the war on terror, now more diffuse and ambiguous than ever, drags on with Pakistan still at the center of its shadowy theater. In the 21st century, the geopolitical spotlight has decisively shifted toward Asia, and within that evolving power theater, the relationship between the United States, China, and the South Asian region, particularly Pakistan, has become deeply consequential, Much of American foreign policy today is driven by an unspoken yet undeniable imperative: the containment of China. This is not about military confrontation alone. It is a multifaceted effort encompassing trade, technology, infrastructure, diplomacy, and influence. China's rapid ascent as a global superpower through mechanisms like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, technological self-sufficiency, military modernization, and expansive economic outreach, has triggered alarm across Western capitals. And while India is often seen as the natural democratic counterweight to China in Asia, Pakistan, ironically, remains a central pillar in America's regional strategy, not because it aligns with Western ideals, but because it occupies a geopolitical location that renders it indispensable in the larger strategy to check Beijing's ambitions. Pakistan's strategic alignment with China is well documented, but that very alignment paradoxically increases its relevance to Washington, which now sees engagement with Islamabad not as optional diplomacy, but as preemptive damage control. At the heart of this dynamic is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, a flagship project under the BRI that aims to link China's western province of Xinjiang to the Arabian Sea via Pakistan's Gwadar port. This corridor bypasses choke points like the Strait of Malacca, over which the US maintains significant naval control, and offers China direct, unimpeded access to the Middle East and beyond. For Washington, this is not merely a trade route. It is a strategic bypass of American-dominated maritime infrastructure and a direct challenge to the status quo. The ability for China to transport energy resources and goods through Pakistan shortens its supply lines, secures its economic interests, and reduces its vulnerability in a crisis. This makes Pakistan not just a participant in China's regional strategy, but a gateway for China's grand design for Eurasian integration. As such, America cannot afford to allow Pakistan to drift entirely into China's orbit without resistance or presence. Maintaining a functional relationship with Islamabad, therefore, becomes less about endorsement and more about proximity, about keeping a foot in the door of a house that is slowly being repainted in Chinese colors. The military dimension of this strategy is equally significant. China's growing naval presence in the Indian Ocean and its ambitions to establish overseas military bases has caused significant unease in Washington. Gwadar Port, funded and largely controlled by Chinese interests, sits at a maritime junction critical to global oil trade. Though publicly declared a commercial venture, Gwadar's infrastructure has potential dual-use capabilities that could one day support Chinese military operations. The US intelligence community is acutely aware of this possibility, and in such a scenario, Pakistan becomes the physical canvas upon which future power projections could be drawn. Therefore, continued American engagement, whether through military aid, counterterrorism cooperation, or diplomatic leverage, is a means to maintain partial influence in a space otherwise dominated by its strategic rival. Washington's dealings with Pakistan, viewed through this lens, become a form of indirect containment, not by confrontation, but by embedded presence and relational persistence. In addition, Pakistan's close proximity to Xinjiang, where China faces global scrutiny over its treatment of Uyghur Muslims, adds another layer of strategic calculus. While the United States has been vocal about human rights abuses in the region, its ability to monitor or exert any pressure is severely limited by geography and access. Pakistan, by bordering Xinjiang, offers an observational perch, albeit constrained, that could prove useful in broader geopolitical negotiations. Moreover, the ideological implications are not lost on American policymakers. China's crackdown in Xinjiang, Pakistan's silence in return, and their mutual framing of religious extremism create a security discourse that further aligns Islamabad with Beijing. This pushes Washington into a corner where continued disengagement risks conceding moral, political, and physical space to an ascending authoritarian bloc. Engaging with Pakistan, no matter how strained the relationship, becomes a strategic necessity for maintaining a foothold in what is fast becoming one of the most surveilled and contested regions in the world. Economically, too, the US understands that abandoning Pakistan to China's full economic influence would not just cede regional development to Beijing, but also allow China to rewrite the financial and political rules of South Asia's emerging markets. Chinese infrastructure investments, debt diplomacy, and soft power outreach in Pakistan challenge American models of influence rooted in conditional aid and liberal institutionalism. In response, the US has attempted to offer alternative partnerships, development initiatives, and financial incentives, but these often lack the immediacy and scale of Chinese offerings. Still, Washington's engagement, even if limited, serves to disrupt total dependency, to create an illusion of choice, and to delay the crystallization of a China-led regional order. Pakistan in this game is both pawn and prize, a country whose cooperation is sought not purely for its own sake, but for the broader competition that looms above and beyond its borders. The nuclear dynamic between India and Pakistan is not simply a bilateral matter. It is a delicate, volatile, and deeply consequential balance that has far-reaching implications for global stability. At the heart of America's nuanced relationship with Pakistan lies the sobering reality that it is a nuclear-armed state, one that exists in direct and enduring conflict with another nuclear-armed democracy, India. This is not a theoretical threat. It is a lived, visible standoff shaped by history, ideology, and contested borders. Since both nations formally became nuclear powers in 1998, the specter of a South Asian nuclear confrontation has haunted every American administration, regardless of its political leanings. The United States does not view Pakistan's nuclear arsenal in isolation. It sees it in the context of the broader regional rivalry, and more alarmingly, through the lens of proliferation, potential state collapse, and the nightmare scenario of weapons falling into non-state hands. These fears have dictated a policy of cautious engagement, continuous monitoring, and often quiet cooperation with Pakistan, even when overt diplomacy seems fractured. Pakistan's nuclear program, unlike India's, was not born from a doctrine of global stature or technological prestige. It emerged from insecurity, fear, and regional humiliation after its loss in the 1971 war with India. It was conceived not as an instrument of power projection, but of deterrence. This origin story makes it psychologically and strategically different from most other nuclear powers. It is also what makes it dangerous. Pakistan's doctrine allows for the use of tactical nuclear weapons, short-range battlefield nukes, which introduces the terrifying possibility of nuclear deployment in a conventional war setting. This blurring of lines between conventional and nuclear warfare is deeply destabilizing and uniquely Pakistani. It adds urgency to every border skirmish, every political assassination, every militant attack in Kashmir, because any of these incidents has the potential to escalate to a level where nuclear options, even if improbable, must be factored into strategic planning. This is the balancing act the United States cannot ignore. It does not support Pakistan's nuclear brinkmanship, but it engages Islamabad to keep the firewalls intact, to ensure that command and control systems are secure, and to discourage any doctrinal shift that might bring South Asia closer to a nuclear flashpoint. What further complicates this dynamic is the internal volatility within Pakistan itself. The military, which controls the nuclear arsenal, is often at odds with civilian governments, creating a fractured power structure that raises serious concerns about continuity and security. The presence of extremist sympathies within segments of the armed forces and intelligence community only amplifies these concerns. The nightmare scenario, the one that keeps American policymakers up at night, is not necessarily a declared war with India, but the possibility of internal destabilization in Pakistan, leading to a breakdown in nuclear oversight. A coup, a rogue commander, a factional divide within the military, these are not abstract fears, but realistic threats in a country where power is fragile and extremism is not entirely on the margins. For this reason, the U.S. remains deeply embedded in Pakistan's security matrix, not because it fully trusts it, but because disengagement would mean relinquishing all influence over a nuclear arsenal that could, under the wrong circumstances, become one of the greatest threats to global security. India, for its part, has shown restraint in the face of provocation, but it too has shifted in tone over the years. With a growing defense budget, a more assertive military posture, and a nationalist political narrative, India is no longer content to absorb attacks and issue diplomatic condemnations. This evolution has narrowed the window for de-escalation during crises, placing even more pressure on outside powers like the U.S. to act as back-channel mediators. Washington understands that in a conflict between two nuclear nations, it cannot take sides recklessly or feed the flames of rivalry. Instead, it plays the quiet diplomat, offering intelligence, suggesting dialogue, occasionally pausing arms sales, trying to preserve a fragile peace that rests more on deterrence than reconciliation. It is in this context that the U.S. maintains its strategic relationship with Pakistan, ensuring that the flow of information continues, that contacts with the military remain open, and that avenues for de-escalation are never fully closed. Another layer of complexity is added by the growing China-Pakistan nexus, which includes nuclear cooperation. China's support has been instrumental in helping Pakistan expand and modernize its nuclear infrastructure. While this relationship is framed as defensive and peaceful, it introduces another axis into the already tense regional equation. For Washington, it is not just about managing two rival powers. It is about understanding and influencing a triangle where Beijing, Islamabad, and New Delhi intersect with overlapping military, nuclear, and geopolitical interests. This necessitates a careful American approach, one that discourages an arms race, promotes transparency, and pressures Pakistan to adopt internationally accepted norms of nuclear governance. It is not a matter of favoritism, but of responsibility. Pakistan's willingness to engage on nuclear safety, non-proliferation, and crisis management becomes the currency in this strategic relationship, one that the U.S. cannot afford to let lapse or fall into purely Chinese influence. India's foreign policy in the 21st century is marked not by alignment or allegiance, but by assertion, an unapologetic assertion of sovereignty, multipolarity, and strategic autonomy. Unlike many countries that find themselves drawn into orbit around superpowers, India has consciously cultivated a posture that resists binary choices and embraces complexity. This independence is not accidental. It is the product of a long historical memory shaped by colonial subjugation, Cold War ambiguity, and post-liberalization economic ambition. India does not want to be a client state, nor does it seek to be a pawn in any other country's geopolitical game. Whether it is its stance on the Russia-Ukraine war, its refusal to join Western-led sanctions, or its parallel engagements with both Washington and Moscow, New Delhi's decisions are informed by a calculus that prioritizes national interest above ideological consistency or alliance-based loyalty. This disposition makes India both a powerful partner and a difficult one, respected for its consistency, yet unpredictable in moments when global consensus is expected. The United States, in its strategic dealings with South Asia, is acutely aware of this trait. While India is a valued partner in initiatives like the Quad, Indo-Pacific Security Cooperation, and Technology Exchange, it remains staunchly non-aligned in critical areas that test Western unity. For instance, India's continued reliance on Russian defense systems, including the S-400 missile defense shield, even in the face of U.S. sanctions pressure, exemplifies its unwillingness to be coerced into submission. Washington may prefer alignment, but what it gets is selective convergence. India will walk with the West when interests align, but will not hesitate to break ranks when they diverge. This was evident when India abstained from United Nations resolutions condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine, citing the need for diplomacy and balance. It was not a defense of aggression, but a defense of autonomy, a signal that India will not let external powers dictate its moral framework or strategic compass. This independent streak extends beyond security into economic and technological arenas. India has not embraced Western economic prescriptions wholesale, nor has it opened its markets to foreign capital without protective guardrails. Its digital sovereignty campaign, preference for indigenization under Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, and its development of alternative financial systems like RuPay and UPI signify a nation that seeks not only to participate in the global order, but to reshape it on its own terms. India trades with the US, China, Russia, and Iran simultaneously. It buys oil from whomever offers the best terms, and it enters into free trade agreements with partners as diverse as Australia and the United Arab Emirates, while also protecting local industries through tariffs. This flexible, non-doctrinal economic diplomacy often baffles Western policymakers, who expect loyalty in exchange for partnership, but India views such expectations as vestiges of a world order it never consented to inherit. India's civilizational identity also plays a subtle but powerful role in its foreign policy posture. It sees itself not as an extension of any bloc, but as a civilization state with its own ethos, priorities, and worldviews. This outlook influences how it engages in global forums. It does not view democracy, for instance, as a Western export, but as an indigenous value rooted in its own ancient traditions. As a result, it resists moral lecturing from the West on issues of human rights or internal governance, insisting that domestic matters remain within the sovereign domain. This does not mean India is closed to reform or feedback, but that it demands such conversations occur on equal footing, not from a perch of superiority. It is this confidence that allows India to cooperate with the US in defense and counterterrorism while simultaneously pushing back against what it perceives as Western bias in international narratives, especially on issues like Kashmir or domestic political tensions. This nuanced, non-aligned posture directly impacts America's strategic calculations in South Asia, particularly regarding its relationship with Pakistan. India's refusal to be a satellite partner means the US cannot rely on India to echo its regional policies or fully endorse its positions. This forces Washington to maintain some level of engagement with Pakistan, even when India sees that engagement as a contradiction or betrayal. In times of India-Pakistan tension, the US often finds itself walking a diplomatic tightrope, trying to de-escalate conflict without alienating New Delhi, while keeping communication lines open with Islamabad. India, aware of this balancing act, neither encourages nor obstructs it, choosing instead to build its leverage through its own channels: military modernization, diplomatic capital, and economic clout. This independent trajectory creates a regional architecture where the US cannot dictate terms but must constantly negotiate its relevance. Furthermore, India's independent foreign policy challenges the traditional assumptions of alliance behavior. It does not equate military cooperation with political compliance. The US may conduct joint naval drills with India in the Indo-Pacific, but India will still host Iranian leaders, resist anti-China rhetoric in forums where it deems it unproductive, and advocate for multipolar global institutions. This complexity often frustrates those who see foreign relations in black and white terms, but for India, it is the very essence of sovereignty. Its relationships are built on overlapping interests, not ideological alignment. It joins climate agreements while protecting its right to industrialize, participates in global tech summits while regulating foreign platforms, and advances regional connectivity while refusing to subordinate its vision to that of any global hegemon. One of the most glaring contradictions in global diplomacy, particularly in the realm of US foreign policy, is the selective invocation of human rights. It is a principle that is, in theory, universally cherished, but in practice it is manipulated, compartmentalized, and often weaponized. The United States, which proudly champions democratic ideals and humanitarian standards, is frequently accused of turning a blind eye to rights violations when they occur within countries it considers strategically important. Pakistan is one such example. From the suppression of political dissent, the silencing of journalists, and enforced disappearances to the persecution of religious and ethnic minorities, the human rights landscape in Pakistan raises serious concerns. And yet, the US government, while occasionally offering verbal rebukes or annual reports, largely avoids taking strong, sustained action. This reluctance is not born of ignorance, but of strategic calculus. Human rights, in this context, become a secondary consideration, subordinated to military interests, intelligence cooperation, and regional balancing acts. The uncomfortable truth is that when national interest is on the line, moral principles are often deferred, diluted, or outright dismissed. This hypocrisy is not merely theoretical, it plays out in deeply consequential ways on the ground. For activists, journalists, and marginalized communities in Pakistan, the failure of powerful democracies to speak or act with consistency is not only disillusioning, but also dangerous. It emboldens authoritarian tendencies within the state apparatus, signaling that international condemnation is both optional and survivable, as long as strategic alignment is preserved. Washington's enduring military aid and security coordination with Pakistan, even amid ongoing rights abuses, sends a clear message that some lives, some freedoms, and some voices matter less than others in the eyes of global power brokers. Contrast this with the swift and loud responses issued by the same actors when similar violations occur in rival nations or politically convenient adversaries. The very same language of accountability and democratic urgency is conspicuously absent when it might inconvenience a geopolitical ally. This inconsistency undermines not only the credibility of US foreign policy, but also the legitimacy of the human rights discourse itself. When rights are selectively defended, they cease to be universal and begin to resemble tools of strategic leverage. The double standard erodes trust, especially among nations in the global South, which often see Western powers invoking humanitarian concerns only when it suits their larger geopolitical objectives. Pakistan, which has long occupied a dual identity, both as a frontline state in America's security paradigm and as a country beset by internal repression, exemplifies this duplicity. The transactional nature of the relationship allows the US to overlook egregious abuses while continuing to frame itself as a beacon of democratic values. This is not lost on India, which watches carefully as its own record is scrutinized in global forums, while Pakistan receives softer censure despite hosting extremist elements, harboring censorship mechanisms, and using blasphemy laws as instruments of fear. Moreover, this double standard has ripple effects beyond Pakistan's borders. It delegitimizes international institutions that are supposed to uphold human rights impartially. If powerful democracies are seen to exempt certain countries from consequences due to strategic interests, then the very concept of international accountability begins to unravel. This erosion weakens not only the moral authority of nations like the US, but also empowers authoritarian regimes everywhere to mimic the same tactics, suppressing dissent under the assumption that geopolitical value insulates them from global pressure. In Pakistan's case, the tolerance of its rights violations becomes a case study in the politics of convenience, and the West's silence becomes a tacit endorsement of repression when it aligns with broader security objectives. This pattern becomes even more troubling when one considers the issue of religious freedom. While the US has repeatedly criticized violations of religious liberty in India, especially under its current political leadership, it has remained markedly more restrained when addressing Pakistan's blasphemy laws, which have led to extrajudicial killings, mob violence, and systemic persecution of minorities like Ahmadis, Shias, and Christians. The imbalance is not one of severity. The cases in Pakistan are often more extreme and institutionalized, but of political emphasis. By calibrating its outrage to fit its alliances, the United States risks politicizing the very values it claims to uphold. It invites accusations not of misguided policy, but of deliberate moral compromise. And while it may preserve short-term alliances and tactical flexibility, it sacrifices long-term legitimacy and influence. The selective nature of human rights advocacy also affects diplomatic engagement. When Washington avoids confronting Pakistan's abuses head-on, it loses leverage not only with Islamabad, but with global audiences that are increasingly skeptical of Western integrity. It signals that there are two tiers of justice, one for adversaries and one for allies. It signals that commitment to human dignity is negotiable, that accountability is conditional, and that moral leadership is not a constant, but a variable determined by military alliances and regional ambitions. This perception, once entrenched, is incredibly difficult to reverse. It feeds into anti-American sentiment, undermines reformist voices within Pakistan who seek international solidarity, and contributes to a cynical worldview in which values are seen as diplomatic currency rather than enduring truths.